So what's the natural way to address a change in what people do? What you go for is generally training. And this has been the #1 implementation approach or implementation idea for quality has been, well, let's train them in these things and then they will do them. Now we've just about all had experience in that to say that how well does that work? Okay, well, the laugh tells me enough, not very well. And if you look at it, you have to say that if this isn't working, and if we're not getting through training the changes in behaviors, methods, and practices that we're looking for, then you have to say there's something else that's going on. And what you have to go down is one level deeper inside and say that what people do is determined by the systems that are in place. Right, so your people systems, your work systems, your managerial systems, you'll have some material, a slide in there, which I probably won't cover, that gives some definitions of this. But your people system, how do you hire people? How do you train them? How do you promote them? Those sorts of things. Your work, how do you divide up the work? Do managers think and your workers do? Right? What is the work of the organization? And finally, how do you do your planning, your controlling, your budgeting, your forecasting, all of those things, your managerial systems? If you want to change what people do here, then you have to start thinking about the systems. And of course, that's where you get the idea of re-engineering. And if you ever had the privilege of working with Dr. Deming while he was consulting, I sometimes wondered, how did he figure this out? But then he started before World War II with companies at this level, training them in statistical process control for the war effort. They did it during the war. After the war, they dropped it. It was gone. He did the same thing again in the 80s, started talking to managers about the 14 points and giving them lessons on the red beads and on variation and so on. And still, again, what he would find is as he was consulting, when managers would say, why isn't this working? One of the first questions he'd ask is, well, how do you pay people? He was coming right down into the systems level saying, don't work up here, work in here. Well, if you work at the systems level and you want to change what the systems are in the organization, Covey says this very nicely, if you want to change the systems, you have to change the systems programmers. And that's not change them out, but rather change the way they think about things. And so this is how we think about things. It's another level deeper yet. Their organizational culture, and let me say that's their mental models or paradigms about how the world works. And again, in Deming's consulting, he walked through this. He would start talking, he'd say, this is what we want our people to do. Well, then what is your pay systems like? Right? And ask those questions. And then he would start in on profound knowledge. Profound knowledge is exactly at this level. It is a mental model or a picture of the world, how it works. Variation, it's really a system, those sorts of things, psychology, understanding, human motivation. So it's at this level that system of profound knowledge operates. I think Deming is by far the first one to actually come and work at this level. So when he started talking to managers about pay systems, he didn't just stop with, well, tell me how you pay people. He'd start to ask them, and why do you think that? Why do you have them on incentive systems? Do you think that they truly would not work if you didn't, they wouldn't put in their best efforts if you didn't have this incentive on top? So he made them walk down through this hierarchy. And this is what I would say is really the breakthrough in thinking about quality, is that although we want to change things up here, we can't work up here, we can't even work at the systems level, but what we need to be doing is working down at this level, which is what profound knowledge is. So this, again, I believe, truly a breakthrough in thinking about change and about quality. One other point in this picture that I'll just point out is that I'm going to say that culture and paradigms is neither right nor wrong. The question is it useful? And depending upon the economic, social, political environment, different situations will be useful. Let's take the industrial model. Let's take incentives and so on. Let's take standardization of work. That was useful at the start of the industrial era. Okay? So it's not whether or not it's wrong or right. It's whether or not it's useful. So this is essentially the breakthrough. And what you see in here, though, underlying in this model, there's some other people who talk about this sort of thing, too. If you've been to prior conferences, you remember some of Tom Nolan's talks, and he's talked about first and second order change. And that's what the difference is here that we're looking at. When you look at first order change First order change within a given system that itself remains unchanged. So it's a change that doesn't change the underlying system. For example, employee of the month. That's a change in behaviors and practices at the very top of this iceberg that you can make that change appear without changing any of the underlying systems. So the employee of the month is still individualistic, reward the individual, and so on. So that would be an example of first order change. Second order change that changes the system itself. And that's what the system of profound knowledge is. So if you actually, I put down adoption of profound knowledge, and I think a better example of this would be change that changes the system itself. It would be having employees use the ideas of variation, to use statistical process control, to actually build knowledge about a process for the purpose of improvement. That would be a second order change because it would require movement down to a deeper level. It would require movement down into the systems level and into the culture and paradigms level. Okay? So you'd have to move down inside. So this is a second order change that Deming is talking about. And why is this important here? Whoops. I may have lost one overhead, and I apologize. Well, the reason that it's important, and I'll have to ad-lib, and you have it in your slides, though. The reason that it's important is that when you're working at these different levels, whether it be at this level, this is a hierarchy of levels, and each set in that hierarchy works to different rules. So there's a whole different set of principles involved when you're trying to change here than when you're trying to change here. Whole different models to understand the situation. And the example slide, which I somehow managed to retain while I lost the most important one, the example slide was this one. If you look at a hierarchy of levels, position being the highest level, then if you want to change positions, you have to move out of this this level and down to the lower level to talk about motion if you actually want to change position. And now if you want to actually change motion, how fast you're going, you have to talk about acceleration or deceleration, and you have to move down to a different level again. But why this is important is that different laws and different relationships govern each one of these levels. Okay? So what we're looking at here, then, is that our target of change is really the paradigms and the organizational culture. This is our understanding of how things work. Right? And how you change this, if this is the target, how you change this requires a whole different set of principles to understand and work with than just changing behavior, like adopting SPC. Right? If we think of that just as a change in behavior, we would do one thing, training. If we look at it as a real change at a much deeper level, second order change, reaching down into this deeper level, then a whole different set of principles apply. And it isn't training. The training is just a small part of what needs to be done. So far, so good. One of the things that I'm doing in this very first part is actually going pretty fast. I feel this is background material to what we want to talk about, so that if there's something you don't understand or it's not clear, ask a question, stop me along the way. Okay, as an example of this, and I have just one clear example to get us out of the theory and into the practice. You might have seen this before, but I think it's the best example that I can give you about the relationship between these different levels. This is General Motors, an example of General Motors. In 1970, General Motors was the most successful organization that had ever existed on the face of the earth. Okay? And in 1970, the executives for General Motors said, geez, what is it that we're doing that makes us so successful? We don't want to lose this formula for success. So what they did is they sat down, the senior management group, and said, what is it that we're doing? And they came out with this list of 10 things. They said, this is the secret to success. What we're about to see, this is the level of paradigms or models, rules for success. It's at the very bottom of the iceberg. Okay? General Motors is in the business of making money, not cars. Okay? Number one rule for success, Let us never forget that. Okay? Now, if that's, now let's, this can make you laugh a lot, and you should look at it, all of it sometime. But here, let me use this as the example to tie all these pieces together out there. This is the first rule for success, operating at the very bottom here. Okay, rules for success. If you believe in this, you're going to put systems in place to preserve this. So if you have, GM is in the business of making money, not cars, what's the system or systems that you would put in place to preserve this? One of the managerial systems you would put in place then would be all of the numbers that you use to drive your company would be financials. It's going to be a very strongly based financial system. You want to look at quality characteristics? Come on. This is the rule for success. You develop your systems based on what your beliefs are. Right? Success comes not from technological leadership, but from having the resources to quickly adopt innovations successfully introduced by others. So no R&D department, right? We're going to have a good spying department or something like that. Okay? You develop a system to preserve, to enact this rule for success. Cars are primarily status symbols. Styling is therefore more important than quality to buyers who are, after all, going to trade up every other year. U.S. car market is isolated from the rest of the world. Foreign competitors will never gain more than 15% of the domestic market. Okay? Energy will always be cheap and abundant. Okay? So it's too good to pass up. We have to go through them all. Okay? Workers do not have an important impact on productivity or product quality. Okay? Now take that and say, what's the systems that you're going to put in place to preserve this? Are you going to have training systems? Think about it. Your people systems, how you hire. Who are the people you actually go out and select if you believe this? Are you going to look for people who are thinkers, learners, doers, so on? Right. How do you train them? How do you promote them? How do you compensate them? Those sorts of things. Consumer movement does not represent the consensus of a significant portion of the U.S. population. The government is the enemy. It must be fought tooth and nail every inch of the way. Strict centralized financial controls are the secret to good administration, and managers should be developed from the inside, which is we have the secrets to success, and we don't want any contamination from the outside. Right? So, but if you take these 10 things, the reason we're going through this is to understand that if we wanted to look at General Motors and talk about adopting quality methods and practices, including process improvement teams and all those other sorts of things, do you think that would happen within General Motors, given the systems that are in place reflecting those core views that people cannot affect quality or productivity, right? And it doesn't matter anyway because consumers buy on styling. So this is the area, this is the primary target area that we're looking at when you're talking about change and in adopting, I would now say adopting system of profound knowledge, but this is in going with the quality movement, it happens here. All right, that's essentially talking about the breakthrough aspect of what Dr. Deming's work. What about the context of it and its importance? One of the things that I hear a lot of people say to me right now is that, well, the quality movement's kind of dying out. You start to see, maybe, hopefully not at this conference, but you start to see dwindling attendance at quality conferences, and the people that do come are lower down inside the organization. Right? The quality czars inside the organizations are having to compete for influence with re-engineering, with self-directed work teams, high-performance workforce, all of those things. So the quality movement is sort of dwindling. So, okay, this is very nice, but are we wasting our time by spending all our time looking at this? If quality is just not a big deal and kind of on the downslide? Well, this is my answer to that. I think it's a very big deal. If you look at the history of progress for mankind, you'll see here this pattern. Mankind is now, what, 50,000 years old, something like that? So this scale is 50,000 years in terms of time for mankind. And if we look at human progress, when humans first started out, we started out in this hunter-gatherer society, right? And you can only get so far in terms of improving with hunter-gatherer. Right? You perfect your tools, you perfect your methods, you learn how to work as a team to corner the animal and trap the animal and all those sorts of things. But you can only go so far in terms of how much progress you can have. After a while, the herds begin to thin. You can't develop a real society because you have to pick up your whole tribe and move them to follow the herds. So that's as far as you can go. And you sort of top out here. It improves, and it sort of reaches its limits, and it creates a whole new set of conditions that are at this point in time. And what happens after hunter-gatherer? What's after hunter-gatherer? Agricultural, right, okay. So the agricultural again, if you look at agricultural, this is a shaky start in the beginning. It's a new concept. It's a new seed of an idea, no pun intended, but a new idea, right? It's a new idea, and it takes a long time. It's like system of profound knowledge is a new idea. Well, here's this new idea, and it takes a very long time to really take off and go, but then it rapidly progresses and eventually does the same thing, sort of tops out, reaches its limits, creates a whole new set of conditions. You go from agricultural then to industrial. And if I drew this to scale, this would have been, we'd be talking out in the last little bit of this time scale. Hunter-gatherer and agricultural occupying most of it. Industrial, just a very short piece of time, 300 years. And already we've reached the limits of its usefulness, and we've created a whole new set of conditions again. And what we're moving into is the information age, and I'd rather call it the knowledge age, but the information age. And actually, I was too enthusiastic in my drawing here. This goes nowhere near that rate of increase yet. We're still in that low growth portion of it. And in here, I would say you see the movements that are going on. You see TQM. I would put in quality circles. I put in self-directed work teams. I'd put in re-engineering. All of these are trying to figure out how to move forward. But the common element here is that where this is again, this is manpower, this is seeds as the technology, here it's machinery as the technology, and now it's computers and telecommunications that are really the technology driving this. So that while we're looking at quality and saying, well, maybe this isn't such a big deal because the quality movement is dying, what you have, though, is as you move from one era to the next, what you're doing is changing this down here, this whole view of the world, okay, and man's relationship to it. So I look at system of profound knowledge as the first good attempt at actually trying to say, what is that world that we're operating in and that we're working in? And I think it needs yet to go forward. But it's, so I think this is a very big deal in terms of the future, even though managers generally don't think so, because we give it the quality label. You know, I don't, just on the aside here, I never talk about quality anymore. I talk about where does their organization need to go, what is their goals, what are their challenges, and they'll bring up all the challenges, and you just start with the principles, okay? It's like don't shoot yourself in the foot by calling it quality. It's too bad it's that way, you know? Okay, so the environment, what we're seeing here is this world that we're living in, we're facing the cumulative effect of our own action. The principle here is that each phase improves. Again, in that slope, each phase improves along the way. It reaches its limits and creates a whole new set of conditions. And these new conditions spawn more complex and an efficient successor. Now, if you look at this, so far so good on this. Anything on this you can't buy so far. Right? Because when you start looking at this is taken out of a whole description, this piece right here, about nonlinear dynamics. And really, when you start looking at thermodynamic literature, nonlinear dynamics, and evolution of systems, self-organizing systems. All of a sudden, by just even putting this slide up here, I'm already using the new picture of the world to describe the past, okay, to describe the patterns that we're seeing. This is not an industrial age picture, Okay, this is already a post-industrial or information age picture of the world that we live in. And so it's happening already, but this is what we want to build. So we want to build a picture of the world that we live in. Like just as in General Motors did this, every company does it for itself, but the backdrop of it is much larger than any one company. It's what we have as a society. And so that's what we're talking about, is that backdrop. Okay, so this is it. We reach its limits and create new conditions and go forward. What we have now is the new environment that we created through the industrial era. We created the new conditions. Okay? I'd say that the driving forces are really computers and telecommunications. The result is globalization, accelerating change, and increasing competitive pressure, all the things that we've been seeing. And when you have globalization and accelerating change, what it does to us is if here is mankind, and if we've operated in this box before, and this is a time and space box, okay? If we've operated in this box before, what we're doing is through telecommunications and computers, we're expanding this box dramatically. Okay? So we're no longer operating inside of this and managing in a small space in terms of time, okay, and actually spread. So space, as in globalization, and time, also being the fourth dimension here. So time, we're accelerating the rate of change, and so, in a sense, accelerating the length of time. It's a relative issue. Right? So by accelerating the rate of change, we're accelerating our experience of the time frame that we're working in, or enlarging the time frame that we're working in. So all of this that we've just done through the industrial era is enlarge the space, physical space and time space that we're operating in. That's a big deal, okay, and we'll come back to it in a minute. Or actually towards the end of the talk. So let's start out with system of profound knowledge that we had here. This is what Deming started with, trying to describe what's this new world that we work in, so we can build organizations and systems and methods and practices that are useful for the information age. We talked about the implication of it here, and that it requires a totally different hierarchical level of thinking. We're not talking about changing people's actions, but how they think. It's a replacement of assumptions. This is something we talked about actually in previous years, so I won't do it in detail. But you can't layer one assumption on top of another. You actually have to surface them and replace them. I can't have as an assumption, an industrial era assumption, that people are lazy and they need extrinsic motivation, and then layer on top of that people are intrinsically motivated. They're not consistent. They can't live inside one person at the same time or one organization at the same time. So you have to talk about replacement of assumptions, which means surfacing the old, getting rid of them, and bringing in the new. Assumptions are collectively held but individually owned. The organization doesn't have an assumption. Its systems reflected. So you're talking about changing individuals, right? How individuals think. The fact that they're collectively held, that's because people have gone through common experience. So these are things we've talked about so far. The other thing that I think is a big deal here in terms of profound knowledge, why we need this, is that it provides us a theory for learning. Right? Now that's something that's probably very familiar to you just from Deming's work right off the bat. And if you look at a theory for learning here, a theory for learning provides a basis for interpretation of the past and prediction of the future. I've already used that with you here tonight. We've already used that right here. We used a theory, an information-based age-based theory, a nonlinear dynamics-based theory, to start to interpret the past. Right? And then also we're going to use it now to begin to predict the future. Right? This becomes really important to have this theory for learning when you have an organization that's gone through employee involvement, quality circles, self-directed work teams, high-performance teams, SPC, and the organization is spinning. Well, if you have a theory, you can actually begin to integrate that and help them understand that, in a sense, what you're going through inside the organization is many of these little curves, one building to the next. Okay? And helping them see it not as a source of confusion, but as progress, especially if you learn from it. And it will also help us then look at what the future is going to bring and helping develop systems to go with those. The other thing about theory for learning is that this is a sort of a reminder on the slide for me, and I think for all of us, is that who's going to learn here? It's you, it's me, it's everybody else inside your organizations. And that theory has to be personally accessible. And I don't think profound knowledge is accessible to most people, as it's stated right now. I mean, it's like it's their nightmares about having to go back to school to talk about variation. You know, those are the classes I failed and had to, pay my roommate to help me with the homework, that type of thing, right? So if you start talking about those things, this, I would say, profound knowledge, Deming's on the right track, but what he's talking about isn't accessible to most people. So I think the challenge that we face is making that accessible, making it something that people can understand. Okay? So that's part of what we want to do today. And the last point that I had on this was about guided evolution, or guided or informed evolution. When we started looking at this picture, we painted this as an evolutionary process, evolving from one stage to the next. Could we have gone from hunter-gatherer to industrial, okay, and bypassed the agricultural? You couldn't, okay? You can't. One builds upon the other. It is an evolutionary process. And so what I'm talking about here is guided or informed evolution is what we want to go through, not just evolution will happen. It's going to happen. The question is can we have a role in guiding and influencing it? Let me give you an example of that. Guided evolution. Here's another thermodynamics knowledge age type of principle. Necessity opportunistically picks up invention. Okay? In other words, invention is out there, and that what happens is that we just don't see it until we essentially have a need to see it. Well, here's the necessity at the beginning of the industrial era. Interchangeability of parts. That was a necessity. There's no way, if you were ever going to get any kind of efficiencies, you had to be able to build standardized parts and interchange them, rather than having one craftsman build a horse-drawn wagon, okay? Build a wagon from start to finish. He makes wheels that are 22.1 inches in diameter, and the other craftsman makes wheels that are 22.4 inches in diameter, and you can't interchange them, or the axles are the wrong length. So you had to have interchangeability of parts to get that progress that the industrial era gave us, okay? Mass production. The invention then was standardization of work. Hadn't thought about it before, just there wasn't a need for it before. Why would you want to standardize? Well, now we've got this invention. The necessity picks it up. So this is what we need out of it. Now there's some other artifacts that go along with this. Artifacts like routine jobs. Now, we think about actually standardization of work. Does that mean that everybody, or if I'm working on axles, I have to do nothing but axles all day long in terms of routine, monotonous jobs? Okay. Incentive systems. Well, if I didn't have monotonous jobs, I probably wouldn't need incentive systems. Standardization of work doesn't have to mean routine, monotonous, boring, degrading jobs. Okay. And work standards. Now that, in terms of how many you have to get out every day. Well, these things are artifacts that tagged along with this invention. Now, when you start talking about evolution and progress, right, this is what we wanted. We picked up it all of it. We incorporated all of it. If you can be selective, if you know where you're going and you know what the invention is, you can separate out the things that are important and essential and get rid of the stuff that goes along with it that you don't want. Right? They wonder sometimes, if you look at this, you'll see this in evolution of different bird species or plant species. Well, why does the woodpecker have this white spot on the back of its head? And they try to come up with some significance for it. Well, maybe that was attached to the gene that gave them the ability to peck wood. Who knows? That's an artifact. We don't need it. And if if we don't look at the reasons behind it, well, we'd have to say, if you want to peck wood, you're going to have a white spot on the back of your head. Okay, that type of thing. So guided evolution, this is what we're moving through, is rapid change. If you have the underlying principles, then you can actually guide and be selective in your evolution. So I want to say guided or informed evolution is what we can be going through, because that's what we're doing right now. So far, so good. Go to high-performance work teams, go to any of that stuff. What is necessary and what is not? What is artifact that we don't need? Okay, but it takes a theory to do that. Okay, so I've sort of made my argument for why profound knowledge is so important. And now I want to say, though, it's of no use unless we can make it accessible to other people. And so I want to think about reframing it here so that, for two reasons. One, so that it is accessible and usable, because even if people take the time to understand profound knowledge, they go, well, this theory of variation stuff, it has very little to do with what I do. It's a huge leap that they have to make from what Deming was talking about to their own work. So we want to reframe it to make it accessible, and also so we can expand it. Because right now, when you look at attempts to expand it, it's like, well, we've got categories, functional categories. We have variation, we have psychology. Well, shouldn't sociology be in there too? So how do you expand it? The existing frame that Deming picked, I think, makes perfect sense. It's academically based, right? But that's what very much he was, academician, in terms of coming out of an era that was functionally based, right? You have you think of your models of universities where you have all the different departments. You think of your models of organizations where you have all these different functional departments. So his frame reflects, actually, the language and framework of the industrial era. No surprise. I mean, that was the language that he knew. When we look at selection of an alternative frame, I think we need to use what he taught us here and ask, well, what's our purpose or what's our aim? What is it we're trying to accomplish? And if what we're trying to accomplish is transformation of individuals and organizations, okay, and this would be what our aim is. Let me say we need to make this a little bit more operational before we can go on. Transformation of individuals and organizations. Let's say what we want to do is change the way we live life. And that's as individuals and as organizations. That's essentially what we want to do. Transformation, change the way we live our life, the way we see our lives and the way we live it. So given that, there's a framework it's not mine, it's Ed Schein's, that I think is very useful. He suggests as an alternative focus, when you start looking at frameworks for culture or paradigm sets, he says that there's two jobs that we have as organizations or as individuals. One, we have to answer these external questions about what is the environment like, the one that we live in, and how do we succeed in it? And that's the fundamental question from us to the outside, from the organization to the outside. So this is the first issue of life. And organizations talk about this in terms of their mission, their strategy, their goals, how they're going to accomplish those goals, what do they measure? Do they measure financials, et cetera, and what are their correction methods? So this would be the first issue. And as a second one, he said, then we have internal issues that we have to address as an organization. And this would be, how do we accomplish the tasks of the organization? And inside of this question, how do we accomplish the tasks, we have what's the language that we use inside to talk to one another. And if you've ever studied language, most Americans don't do much in terms of language study, but if you study German and you realize that the only word that they have for leadership is der Führer, and it's just, wow, okay, you see how language shapes the way people think, okay? And so you look at common language as being one of the issues that organizations have to have. The boundaries of work. What is it you do and what is it that I do? What are the boundaries of interaction? Okay. in terms of, can you go talk to the president, of your company, and so on? What's the criteria for power? Does power come from knowing, or does power come from controlling more and more people, or does power come from success? Okay, so these are the internal issues that we face. How do we accomplish the tasks? The two things that we're looking at then is what's the definition of the environment and how to succeed in it. So we want to define it and how to succeed in it. And then how do we accomplish the tasks inside? Rewards, promotion, and so on. Oh, and I put in here relationships between people, subordinates, bosses. Even my language already suggests hierarchy, subordinate, bosses. So what's the relationships between people? Okay. So these are the tasks that we want a new understanding to inform. So far, so good? Yeah? Okay, I see a few. Okay, stop me, that's your job. The alternative frame, and although this looks pretty academic, I've been using it for years in my own thinking, and it makes all the sense in the world to me, by Ed Schein. Actually, when I first saw this, I can remember Dr. Deming had just gone through his surgery, his major surgery about a year and a half before he had passed away. And I read Ed Schein's book, Organizational Culture and Leadership. And if I took like the 5 most influential books that I ever read in my entire life, this was one of them. Right? I'd have to say it shook me to the core when I read this book, because I thought Deming's system of profound knowledge was like, wow, this is the fundamental. This is the foundation. It doesn't get deeper than this. And then Ed Schein puts out this categorization, and I realized that profound knowledge was only a special case of this. Okay? It blew me away. but I find it useful, and let's go through it. First one being, what's the nature of the world that we live in? Now, the words he uses are a little bit more esoteric, but what's the nature of the world we live in? And remember that first question that we asked in terms of external issues, our definition of the environment and how we define the environment will determine how to succeed in it. Okay? So, what's the nature of the world that we live in? What's our man's relationship to that world? Now, nature of the world we live in, quickly as an example, variation. It's not deterministic. There's variation in the world. Okay? What's our relationship to that world? The nature of human nature, the nature of human activity. This is asking, what does it mean to be human? Are we learners? Are we creators? Are we thinkers? Or are we doers? Are we animals, essentially, in the animal kingdom? The nature of human activity and the nature of human relationships. And just as, the heads up on this, let's look at cooperation versus competition, right? Nature of human relationships. So I find this, and we'll go through it in detail, that's what we're here for tonight, but this is a lot more useful to me, at least in terms of reframing profound knowledge and then giving me a place and a way to expand it. Okay. Nature of reality. What is the world we live in? How does it work? And how do we know it? Okay, how do we know it? Do we know it mystically, spiritually, communing with God, using mushrooms? How do we use, or in the industrial world, take out that ruler, right? That's how we know it in the industrial era. We know the world by if it's how's that saying go? You can't measure it if you can't manage it if you can't manage it if you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, it isn't real. Okay? So how do we know the world? And if we start with, and what I'm going to do with each one of these, by the way, is as I go through each one of these, I'm going to go through it and first look at the industrial era that we're coming from. I'll look at what Deming has to say about this particular point, and then I'll expand it for what this information or knowledge age is about, and go further on. Okay? So if we take this first one, the nature of reality, and say, in the industrial era, what's the nature of the world we lived in? Well, we took a very mechanistic and static view of the world. Okay, the industrial era, it's right there, industry. It's a machine model of the world. Think about our school systems, right? The school systems, kids are interchangeable cogs in the school system. You break the school down into individual pieces and parts, okay? You have a complicated, in this area you have the view that if you have a complicated whole, well, that's okay. All we have to do is break it down into very simple, small little parts. And by knowing the parts, we can know the whole, right? So you have here complicated whole is no problem. We can do it. This is the engineering attitude that you break it down to simple parts and you can know the whole. These simple parts are independent of one another. Therefore, the whole is knowable and controllable through the parts. So I can control anything, and I'd have to say here the best example of this view is, in a sense, the lunar missions. Now, we can take anything. It was the sense of anything, nothing is beyond our reach, because we can take this complicated world and break it down into little parts and deal with it that way. So we see that in our social structures. We see that in organizations. We see it in schools. The whole is knowable and controllable through the parts. And you look at, they look at it as very linear and additive. And if it's linear and it's stable, well, then I can predict it. Think about your business planning, right? Your business planning. Well, next year, if last year growth was 10%, well, next year you just keep plotting that straight line out there, right? It's linear, it's predictable. And I'd say that this viewpoint is best shown or typified right in this picture. You know, and this is our organizations, our view. How we see the world determines how we manage it. Well, this is how we choose to take large organizations and manage it. We break this complicated whole into simple, independent parts. And I can manage this whole organization by controlling each of the individual parts. The results or the implications of this, what we've had in the industrial era, the aim is one of control and to maintain order. The focus becomes where are we becomes this control piece. You know, one of the things I'm not sure how to do as we're talking about this is how to do a litmus paper test to see where we are on this. Let me ask you a question of you here. Can you give me an example of how in the industrial era we have management systems that are focused around control? Just to see if we're on the same page here. Pardon? Okay, performance, how does that illustrate control? Okay. Okay, so you... Okay, expected standards. And we have here, we have performance evaluations. Pardon? Timekeeping? Clocks, time clocks, okay. Okay, good. All right, I feel a little better now. Okay, good. The focus is one of position and a scoreboard, right? When you look at it, what they're looking at is their earnings this month, right? It's a scoreboard type of approach. What's the earnings this month, or the budget this month? And it's a scoreboard in terms you want this linear change from one period to the next, right? And you're concerned about what's your position today. Who's ahead of who? Am I up to my budget, or am I beyond or near my budget? And that's a control issue, working to budgets, working to goals, those sorts of things. So you have that. You have your management by objective. It's all reflecting this industrial control mentality or machine mentality. You get functional and hierarchical structures inside, right? Because you look at you look at a car, and I could break it down into the fuel systems, and I can break it down into the electrical systems, and I can break it down into your chassis and those sorts of things. We do the same thing with our organizations. Our organizations are machines, Okay? We manage them just like machines. And with MBO, we're doing the same thing. We give performance criteria for each one of those functions. We have functional hierarchical structures. We get individual incentive systems based on the fact that we have independence between all of the pieces and parts. And you have measurement, which is all focused on present position. Where are we today in terms of sales orders? And if you work inside of this is one of the things that always amazed me about organizations, is everybody was worried today. Open the paper. What's our stock price today? Okay. Or have your manager come down. What's the sales today? How many orders came in today? It's a position and scorecard type of mentality. Okay. What Deming had said, and to really contradict this, and began with, when you look at what's the world like that we live in, he started talking about appreciation of a system instead, and said, forget this mechanistic business, okay? This mechanistic or machine model of the world. You have interdependence and dynamism, which really is going to go down here. But let's say interdependence right off the bat. I can't look at things as independent pieces and parts. He talked about variation, that the world is not deterministic, which was a big shock to most managers, and still is a big shock to most managers, that if you predict or project that your sales are going to be X, how come you don't get exactly X? And why do you have variance reports? It's not deterministic, and there's something very big underlying analytic studies that he talks about. And the idea here, under analytic studies, is that whatever the population that you survey today is not the same one that's going to be there tomorrow. It is continually changing through time. And so analytic studies are all about understanding relationships, prediction via relationships. In a mechanistic world, it's prediction via current position. Well, if I earn so much today, I can project I'll earn so much tomorrow. All right? This is prediction via relationships, and that's what analytic studies do. They build your understanding of how sales relate to orders, how they relate to, relates to quality, relates to on and on and on. So you're looking at relationships. You'll hear Sengi talk about this a lot. Sengi talks mostly about relationships and understanding the world through relationships as versus current position. So far, so good? Okay. And I think the best condensation of that is right here. I mean, this picture to me is probably worth more than just about everything Deming wrote in terms of encapsulating what he's talking about. It's not functional. It is actually what we call an open system. Here's the environment. Consumers and suppliers are the environment. And you are learning from consumers, using that to come inside, work with suppliers, and change what you produce and put out. It's, again, a dynamic, open system sort of view. So Deming's reality, I would capture it this way. If I started to talk about, and this is how I do talk to organizations about what is it we have to keep in mind if we are going to be successful. When you're looking at high-performance work teams or re-engineering and so on, the question here is to ask, number one, are you enhancing the value that you create for your consumers, okay, and continually improving your ability to do so? This is that evolution piece, and focused on value creation, not scoreboard, but value creation. And not value as in not value as in cheap, but quality was what value was when Deming started working with industry, okay? What value was at, let's take Russia, I want to say 5 years ago. Value to them was availability, right? It's like they'd take a refrigerator even if it didn't work, because the value was in having a refrigerator, because they couldn't get refrigerators, okay? They couldn't get cars. So value to them was availability. When Deming was around, we had availability. You could buy a car. There was no shortage of cars, no shortage of refrigerators. What there was a shortage of was reliability, okay? And quality, what we came to call quality. And now value is more along the lines of customization, quick turnaround time, those sorts of things. And this is continually changing. Yes?
This isn't on this slide, but 2 slides ago.
Okay.
Repeat the question, please.
Okay. The question, it goes back to a couple of slides ago, and it breaks our flow a little bit, but it's worth touching on because this is a big deal. Prediction via relationships. If I wanted to, I've worked in an industry in making weapons and things like that, so mechanics and that type of thing. And when you want to predict how this process is going to turn out if I turn up the heat on it, as an example. Well, if I turn up the heat or try to move it through faster, the only way I can predict that without having numbers is by understanding the effect of heat on the metals and everything else that's going on. So prediction, and this is the heart of analytic studies. The heart of analytic studies is not to get out a set of numbers that you could say 99% of this population existing today exhibits these characteristics. The heart of analytic studies is understanding relationships between factors so that you can predict what might occur in the future under different circumstances. Okay? So it's understanding cause and effect relationships that allow you to make predictions. Okay? It's not numbers-based, it's relationship-based. The way Deming sees the world, value creation, I would say this is the number one thing that he talks about. He talks about the customer never asked for anything, right? It's the supplier's job to anticipate what it is the customer will value. So this is the value creation issue. And this is, to me, what he was focused on. A process unfolding through time, not looking at it as static, and again, goes back to the analytic studies. The organization's not static. When you left your job on Friday, your organization was whatever it was. When you go back on Monday, it's not going to be the same organization that it was on Friday. Okay? It's just like any assembly line, any process whatsoever. You've changed through your experience. Who knows what's happening to the rest of the people, okay, in your company, but you're changing through your experience here today. When you go back to your company will not be the same as it was before. And it goes along also with this graph that we talked about in the very beginning in terms of evolution, in terms of progress. This is not static. This is continually moving and building upon the shoulders of experience and time. So what we have to look at is instead of addressing our organizations as fixed and constant and stable, they're not. It's essentially a lie. It's a process unfolding through time. You have the choice of guiding that evolution, but it is not a fixed entity. A machine might be a fixed entity, okay? A process, your organization, and people are not. All right. So this is what I would capture so far as saying that this is what my sense of what Deming sees the world that we're moving into. Value creation, information age, knowledge age, is continually focused on anticipating what it is the customer will value. Okay? And keeping your eye on that ball. That's what the organization should be focused on quality. The organization should be focused on value creation. Always, always, and always. Okay? This thing, a process unfolding through time, it is continually changing and evolving, and it's moving forward. It doesn't move backward, it only moves forward. You can't go back to a prior state. Your job is to essentially manage the continual evolution of that. Let me point out, most change models say present state, or whatever it is, present state, transition state, and then to future state, as if these states are locked, and there's a period of change, and you move from one thing that's constant to another. It's not that way. It's continually changing, okay, throughout. And it takes a whole different means and method of management than to look at it as managing it as a stable state. A few more minutes on this piece and we'll take a break. What I want to expand this now. We looked at what the industrial age was about. We looked at what Deming said on this, right? Let's take some more of what's going on and what we know. This is what I say, common knowledge. It's accepted knowledge already. It is in the realm of chaos theory. It's in the realm of ecological theory, neural networks, thermodynamics, all of this. And what's so neat about all of these sciences is that they're converging. In the industrial view, what we have, if we have here's the planet Earth, we looked at man and life in particular as an exception to the universe. Do you know what entropy is? Are you familiar with that? Who doesn't know what entropy is? Don't be afraid of entropy. Okay, entropy is basically saying it's if you took thermodynamics in college, you'll learn that life is, what you find is the universe is continually moving towards a state of entropy, which it means randomness, total randomness, complete randomness. And that's the driving force in the universe, is this move towards entropy or randomness. They call it disorder, but I'd rather call it randomness. And what we've always done is said, well, life is just the opposite of that. Life is order, it's organization, it's moving forward, it's creating. So we always said that, well, we believe in what the physicists tell us about entropy, but life defies entropy. And so somehow we were outside of the world, okay? Well, this is, looking at it this way actually reflects our industrial view. We looked at this piece, this part, as if it were independent of everything else. Okay? What you start doing in an information age and you start thinking about systems is that a piece and part doesn't exist in a vacuum. Okay? It actually exists as part of something else. And you'll see this, by the way, also even in therapy. They used to have, or counseling. If you had counseling for a child or counseling for any type of personal counseling, the counselor always dealt with the individual as a piece, as a part unto itself. If you have any experience with counseling now in the workplace or any place else, counseling is now of the system. Understanding that you don't work in a vacuum by yourself. You're not independent, you're part of something else. And it's those other parts that influence and drive you as much as you do yourself. So it's the same thing we're going to see here. The change in view is, instead of looking at Earth and saying, well, we're an anomaly in the universe, which is tending towards randomness from the Big Bang to disorganization, just randomness. Start to look at it as a change in view and say, well, here's the Earth, okay? But guess what? It sits between the sun and all of this space, or vacuum. The sun, hot, all this energy up there. And here is space, which is almost at absolute zero. Freezing cold space. And when you look at it, what happens is, when you look at the Earth now, it sort of sits in this interface between the hot sun and space. And when you look at it this way, you actually start to get a very different view of what life is. Okay? Here, if you didn't have any life and you had a cold planet like Mars, right? No life on it. And again, let me talk about entropy for a second. If we went to total entropy, instead of having a hot sun and cold space, we'd have like a warm universe. Every molecule inside the universe would be the same temperature throughout. Okay? Stable, equilibrium, no organization at all. Well, here you've got a tremendous disequilibrium, okay, tremendous pressure. Think about here, let me give you the example of a hot room. You're in a hot room in a house, and it's cold outside, it's winter, okay? Well, what happens is that the heat wants to find a way to move out. There's a differential, and you can find every crack in your windows and under your doors and everything else. And the heat will actually find and flow through the crack or the area that allows it to move the fastest through, and allows that huge disequilibrium between hot inside and cold outside. It's going to come to equilibrium, which would be entropy. Okay? That's like entropy. So what you have is that what we're going to find in this information age view of things is that we're not going to look at the world as little pieces and parts that are stable, but we're going to look at larger systems and say that what actually drives the world is huge energy differentials, disequilibriums. Right? Let me give you one more quick example of that. If you were in a third world country, you don't mind being poor. It's when you're poor next to the very rich guy next door. Poverty is not an issue until all of a sudden you have amazing wealth right next door that you can see. Okay? So it's disequilibriums that actually drive the marketplace, that actually drive life. Because what they're saying here is that when you take a cold planet like Mars, Mars does nothing to actually dissipate this huge energy differential. It wants to flow from hot to cold. It wants to flow. Mars does nothing to do that. But yet Earth, well, we know what plants do. They capture the energy and they radiate it out into the atmosphere. Now you have an atmosphere around the Earth, okay, that's warm, that wasn't there before. And it's actually looking at it, and what we're coming up with is a principle that they call MEP. Entropy always increases at the maximum possible rate. It's going to find the fastest way to become an equilibrium, to become stable. So if you have your really hot room and you're really cold outdoors, and if you could measure where the heat flowed out, okay, from your room to the outside, it would find the fastest possible exit out of that room, and that's where it's going to go. Okay? So it's taking this idea of a dynamic world, instead of looking at it as static, it's very dynamic. And I'll just give you a couple more examples on this, and then we'll take a break. My husband is a naturalist ecologist by background. We go walking out in Wyoming and Colorado and places like that where you see earth and, not just trees, but earth and so on as well. And I look at a hillside and I say, geez, that's a pretty hillside. I'd really like to have a house on that hillside. And he'd say, you wouldn't want a house on that hillside. That hillside's moving. And it's like, it's moving? Excuse me? Looks pretty stable to me. I see cows out there and so on. And he says, well, if you look at the trees and you look at the vegetation that's growing on it, you can see that that hillside is moving. And he said, so I'd ask him to say more about that. And he'd tell me, well, within 5 or 10 years, it will move by at least 6 or 8 inches. And that's a considerable amount on a foundation. But he looks at it, and he sees not this beautiful hillside, current position. He sees change. He sees the forces that are driving the change. Okay? When we look at the Wall Street Journal, you open up, you see the stock market, you see current position. But yet the whole future and where we're going and what you need to manage for is change. And change is being driven by differentials and disequilibriums. It's a whole lot to swallow for the moment. And I think it's probably a real good note to take like a 5 or 10. How about, let's say 5, that means you'll be back maybe in 10? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, let's go. All the important people are here, right? Right, okay, let's go. Right. Here's the thing that is so striking to me about this, when I started reading about this and learning about this, is when we think about man, remember I drew this little hand-drawn picture earlier, saying that what telecommunications and computers does is it changes the size of the box that we live in. Okay? Inside this box, time and space, things were very stable, and we saw the linear portion of the world. We can see inside this box, things are linear, stable, and so on. It's when you expand it, and you expand, you start looking at the whole system, that you see that what drives the larger system are things like disequilibrium and energy flow. So the principles that are driving out here are not really visible when you're inside this little small arena. And the example that I would use here is that Deming talked about this too, is if you look at it, when you're in a very small area, like the size of this block, and you're designing the convention center, Euclidean linear geometry is just fine. It's perfectly fine. The world is linear for all practical purposes within the space of this block. But now if you want to start designing something much bigger, you're going to have to start taking into account the curvature of the Earth. And that's essentially what I believe it is we're finding, is that by our own actions, we're expanding the frame that we're working in. What worked inside this smaller region doesn't work outside in the larger region. Linear and stable in here, okay, yes, it sure appears that way. We can send a man to the moon. Very much we can control within this framework. But when you start looking at this much bigger picture and start encompassing more, then the rules governing that larger picture are dramatically different. And it's all about disequilibriums and energy flows that really drive it. So if you start looking at what does it mean to your company, well, inside your company, in a short time space, you can have methods like incentive systems and so on. And incentive systems are going to work in hierarchy. Top-down type of structure will work just fine. In a small little box of time and space, it's optimum within that box. Okay? I thought it was me. Okay. It's optimum within that box, but when you expand the box and you start saying, now we have to be a global company, right? And we're looking at not just being successful within a 3 or 4 month period, we're looking at being successful over 10, 20, 30 years. Then those systems that we had in place for local optimization don't work at all. Okay? The hierarchy, the control, the incentive system, those things no longer work. So this is, to me, really sort of the heart of what's going on. You look at this inside this little box, the Earth, as if we were the center of the universe, and what we see in here at this point in time is stable, unchanging. Look at the bigger picture, and you start to see tremendous change and driving all of life. It's this interaction. It's the line where the two contact. Hot sun, cold space, and it creates a mechanism to drive entropy, drive that movement of energy through, okay, to move to equilibrium. And, yes? Yes, good. All right. What you see here is how this, and the question was, how does this explain why present state, change state, future state doesn't fit with this type of view? What you have here is this tremendous equilibrium, which is actually driving the continual evolution. It's the engine behind the curve that we looked at earlier. Let's see. So much for that. Okay, here it is. I'd say that this energy differential is the engine. Nope, it's not it. The engine behind this curve, this continual moving curve, right? Because what you're doing is you're actually capturing energy, and if you start looking at productivity and biomass, you're capturing energy and moving it through, all right, with all of these different steps that we're taking along the way. So it's not like we're going to come to the information age and say, oh, we're there. This is the final state of evolution, we're there. It won't be. Actually, what we're coming to, and it was going to be like the next slide, is that the change in view here is that life is an ordered flow, and it's increasing the rate and efficiency at which energy moves through. And this is human life, plant life, etc. And that evolution is continually looking at acceleration of flow. And so one of the things that comes out of this is that the rate of change, it may seem like it's getting faster. Guess what? That's what the thermodynamics models predict. They predict that the rate of change will only continually get faster and faster and faster. Okay? That you build complexity, that with this growth comes complexity and interdependence. This is another reason when I started to read this, it was like, wow, it's predicting higher interdependence. It's predicting that. And if you look at evolution of life, right, let me take a real simple model back to Biology 101, and if I took the Earth and covered the Earth with single-cell plants covering the entire Earth, at that point, there's nothing else that can happen to move energy through. They're all there. Now you have to wait till they die off, unless you actually get them to become a more complex structure, like I'll become a stem cell if you become a leaf cell, all right? And by doing that, you create interdependence and complexity. And that's essentially what the human body is too. I mean, if you had single-cell animals across the whole face of the Earth, well, the only way that you can move energy through, continue to increase the rate energy move through is to develop complexity. So you differentiate into liver cells, heart cells, brain cells, and so on, and complexity and interdependence. So this is actually predicting that in this sort of case, you will get complexity and interdependence, and it's all to accelerate the flow of energy. Okay? I will give you another example of this. Boiling water as an example. Think about it, this is energy flow again. Think about a pot of water sitting on your stove, no heat underneath it. It is total entropy within, random temperature inside. You have little molecules of water that bounce off each other and transfer energy that way. But it's all at the same temperature. Turn the flame on underneath, or turn up the heat on your stove. All of a sudden, you're creating this tremendous differential between the bottom of the pot and the temperature of the water in the pot. Well, it could use the same process it was before. Random cells start moving faster and faster, bumping into each other, trying to dissipate the energy that's at the bottom of the pot. But eventually, it actually self-organizes. It self-organizes into these boiling. Boiling is where it actually does a phase change. It's no longer just water that's randomly bumping into each other, but it does a phase change, and that's self-organizing, the property of self-organizing. One more example on that is here you may not be able to see it in Ohio. If you live west, you can see it. What happens here is there's so much water in the air all the time, the sky basically looks white. But if you live someplace where it's really dry, you'll see clear blue skies, and what you'll have is the earth heats up from the sun, the air is cold up above, and you've got to dissipate that energy differential. And what you have is a seed essentially forms, moves up, and you get the formation of cumulus clouds. Cumulus clouds is self-organized, right? And one thing is, if you look at work teams, right, they self-organize. No one has to direct or control. And this is one of I thought the big lessons coming out of this as well, is that the world is self-organizing. We don't have to direct and control it. We can guide it, and we can use knowledge to inform it. But guess what? It happens. That's what entrepreneurship is actually about. And if you think about you put a self-managed work team out there, that's what they're doing, right? They are finding a way to take all this work, the pressure of all this work, and essentially get it done. And if you have chaos, eventually a group will find out and figure out how to get the thing done, and they organize themselves to do it. But it's a real interesting principle that as you move into this other arena outside the larger space, you don't have to have somebody sitting on top of the hierarchy trying to control the world with puppet strings. It's going to happen anyway. Evolution change is happening all the time, anyway. And what you have to do is not think about controlling it, but rather, I want to say, channeling it, using your knowledge to inform it, letting it happen. So it's going to really change in our iceberg. As we start to change our picture and understanding of the world that we live in, it's going to dramatically change our people and work systems. Can you begin to see some of the changes here that this might already engender? Like what? Yeah.
Your metaphor about self-organization, molecules don't have emotions and values, and human beings do. And when you try to self-organize with competing value systems and competing selfish needs, could that lead us to maybe re-examine that metaphor a little bit?
I think it makes it a lot more complicated, but I think it still works. Because one of the things you have is that you do have individuals, but even when you start working with a hunter-gatherer, we self-organized without anyone, controlling the stream. All of this evolution was without a master plan on someone's part, King so-and-so, engineering all of this. This essentially happened through, our individual activities. Hunter-gatherer, if we put us all in the room and they said to us, we have to clean up this whole hall and prepare them and do whatever else, we'd figure out a way to do it and we'd organize to do it. It becomes more complex, but it is still there. The other thing that comes out of it too is that you can't predict the whole from the individual parts. So the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. An individual, a cloud is just water molecules. But if you look at one water molecule and you look at the properties of a water molecule, you never would have predicted clouds, okay? You never would have even predicted ice from just the characteristics of a water molecule. And so it actually takes what was key to the mechanistic world, which is we can know the whole by knowing the parts, and saying, that isn't true, okay? We are no more than carbon, hydrogen, oxygen atoms. Now, if you want to put spirit in there, they have ways, but all the characteristics, let's say, that of humans or even in animal, if you don't want to talk about humans, let's take an animal. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, all those different molecules, could we have ever predicted that by knowing just the characteristics of the individual molecules? So the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts, and that organization tends to happen on its own. So it's I found this and learning and studying about this over the last year just makes me take this step back and really sit back and think about it. And I have to say it's real hard to change the way you think about how you run your world, though, how you interact, and saying that it's going to happen even if I don't make it happen. And what I can do is guide it, inform it, be part of it. And one of the things about chaos theory, you've seen the commercials on TV, right? Butterfly flaps its wings here and you get a storm over there. Well, that holds true too, is that your actions, even the smallest action, can affect the whole, but it cannot control it. And I think that's something that people sitting at the top of the hierarchy are learning, or maybe still have yet to learn, is that they cannot control it. Okay? They cannot control the whole larger system. That's where you get into the ideas of, I want to say, having employees involved and having all of the information that they need, because you can't control it from the top. You're not going to be able to. It's an illusion that you can. And probably all of you feel that yourselves, have experienced that. Oh, so what I was asking, though, and geez, no matter how much time they give me, it goes too fast. Let's keep going. We're going to keep on going. Like we're going to move fast. Some of the implications that I wanted to hit, though, just no final structure. There is no best one way to be, because it's always going to be changing on you, right? Your organization, when you go back to work, is going to be different than when you left it. There is no such thing as a final structure. If there's no final structure, there's no final or best way of being. Okay? There's no absolute knowledge. And same thing about no end state. It's just this, it's a process, as Deming looked at it, that process continually unfolding through time, kind of hidden in the concept of analytic studies. All right. Man's relationship to the world around him. Right? And the questions you would ask here, is humanity outside of the world, as in not part of it, separate from it, above the world? I mean, do we dominate it? Is it there for our pleasure to serve us? Are we part of the world, or are we submissive to the world? The world is so much bigger than we are, and we can't control it, and it's just poor us little human beings. And this is what this category is: industrial age. The backdrop. Again, you view the world as a machine, linear, independent pieces and parts. And I thought the best way to actually capture what the mechanistic view was, this is engraved on the top of the engineering building at my alma mater. Strive on. The control of nature is won, not given. But it's the world is controllable. The whole world is controllable. We can send a man to the moon. We can control the world. Okay? So if you look at some of the other things that go along with it, in the industrial age, we have man as outside and above nature. He's not part of this world. The world's laws don't apply to us, and that we are above it. It's there to serve us. We have an ability to know and control the world, and so you have the sense of dominance and supremacy. Some of the consequences that you see from that. In management structures, you get sub-optimization. Okay? Pieces and parts are linear and independent, and we can control them. And we forget then about all the interdependencies that are there and the longer-term things there. And what you get is, again, the sub-optimization, such as acid rain, ozone depletion, third world poverty, those sorts of things, some of the things that happen out of it. And one of the things about controlling the world, and this is perhaps the most insidious one, and the one just that Deming railed against, is that when you believe that people can control the world, what you tend to focus on when you're managing is on winners and losers, right? Because if you're a loser, that's because you didn't do your job, because you didn't control your world. The world is controllable, and you didn't do it. Okay? And the winners are the people who did. People are the sole cause of their outcomes when you take this as the world is controllable. You see business plans and strategic plans that reflect this, right? And you ever submit a business plan or to up above, and they come back and they say 10% more, redo it, we want 10% more. And you're going, wait, we're telling you how things are. And it's like, 10% more, your numbers have to be higher. We want higher projections for next year. It's this idea that you are the sole cause of what happens. Okay, coming out of man's relationship to the world. What Deming starts to say in this regard is that we are part of a larger system. All the elements are interdependent. Okay? We're not above, this is basically saying we're not outside of the world. We're interdependent with it. You are going to have acid rain and ozone and so on along the way. And this thing, though, the most important things are unknown and unknowable. I mean, some of the stuff he said has just such profound ramifications to it. He's saying that, wait a second, you're not going to know. You don't have that control. Okay? The whole isn't knowable from the individual pieces and parts. This is a big deal if you take this and start to say, what does it mean then in terms of management? Yes?
Would that not be the exact opposite then of the industrial age? You point out that it's not measurable, it's not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when you talk about industrial age, one of the questions, the key questions to ask is, how do we know the world? Industrial age, it's fixed, it's unchanging, and so we measure it. Current position is enough to know it, so we measure it. Here we're saying it's continually evolving and changing, so current position doesn't tell me much. I have to know relationships between how does sales affect, and how does quality affect customer satisfaction, and all these relationships that are important. And this, yes, and this is going even further in saying that we can't even begin to know it. We're going to know the world through relationships more than we are through current position. It will change our measurement methods, our planning methods. I mean, I think we've only just tapped the surface in terms of what organizations are going to be. And I think Deming was absolutely right when he said to managers, you've got to throw out the existing system of management. I mean, he is exactly right. It's just that the methodology might not be viable. You can't throw it out and start from scratch. You're going to have some process of evolving through it. Yes, one more, and then I'm going to move on. Yes?
Well, you also said that a system must be managed, and that a system must have an aim. So how do you take into account an aim?
The system must have an aim. This is something that actually we talked about a lot. Every system has an aim, one way or another. Okay, it's either implicit or it's explicit. Your system, your body has an aim: survival and reproduction. Okay, have a good life. That's what every system has one, and so I think he was making clear, trying to make it rather than. Make it explicit rather than something that's hidden and unspoken and unknown. So it's make it known. And in terms of managing the system, that's a very interesting point. It will evolve. It does evolve and change ongoing. I believe that. I'm going to say let's take that one outside because I got to think about it. How about that? And I'm not trying to put you off. It's just that if we're going to move, we're going to have to do it. It's a very good question. Knowledge age. Man's relationship to the world then, so taking what Deming said, but let's keep on going. The world is an unfolding process. We talked about that, being driven by this huge energy flow on this path of evolution. It created us, and it actually directs our action as well, in at least the biological level. It creates and directs our action. We contribute to it. It's beyond our control and subject to our action. Okay? We can't control the world, but it is subject to our action. So ozone depletion, acid rain, poverty, all of those things, whatever it is subject to our action, but we can't control it. It's a very different view. And continued human existence requires going with this process rather than against it. Because if you try to say, well, we want to defy these laws and move against it, the world's going to win out. This larger process from the Big Bang on is going to win out. Okay, I'd love to talk about this one about what this means. That's going to have to be an aside because that's a very interesting social and biological question. All right, we've covered two. We've covered what's the world that we live in and man's relationship to it. That covers most of the meat. There's a couple more things to cover in here, though, and these are important, but you're seeing my own biology and technical background to say that I'm not going to be the best person to cover this and really explore this in detail. I can give you some starting points on it. The nature of human activity, and this is asking the questions, what should humans do? Obviously, my writings, as I try to put from one to the next, it just didn't work because I was trying to modify it before the talk. Nature of human activity. What should humans do? Are they active or are they passive? What is work? What is play? What do humans do? Is the nature of human activity. If we look at the mechanistic model and the backdrop here, the industrial age, what humans do? Well, they win over nature. They conquer nature. Okay, in this mechanistic world, we do problem solving. Fixing things, fixing our broken machines, fixing our broken organizations, fixing results. We try single point actions to change from wrong to right states. We're always trying to go in and find what's the fix. Okay, and it's a single point of action, not a systems perspective. I'm talking about the counseling issue again. One single point, not a whole systems view and approach. The focus of human activity in the industrial era has been towards individual ends, right? But if it's independence, if you believe in the idea of we're all independent of one another, like in the mechanistic view, this is the best way to ensure the survival of the whole, is to have everybody go after their own individually. The individual ends, again, works under the concept of independence and survival of the fittest. What are those ends? I would say maximizing personal position, accumulation of wealth, power, and control. And this has been the focus of human activity in the industrial era. Human motivation, and the human motivation is accomplishment of those ends, and it's extrinsic. If we look at what Deming talks about in this, let me say something else. Nature of human activity, then, In the industrial age, what we would get is people maintaining the status quo. You don't want change because it's the existing status quo, the existing structures that enable you to get your position. Right? It's the ladder that you're on. And you have then incentive pay, internal competition, these things as also fallouts of that. What Deming talks about in terms of activity, people have intrinsic motivation. He talks about activity, joy in learning, joy in work. It's a whole different model here. People are inherently learners or creators, and creators. Big deal here, expand the pie. This one was another one of those incredible insights that I didn't fully appreciate how much ahead of his time he was until I'm sitting down and doing all this work, and he's saying, expand the pie, not maintain the status quo in stable state. And if you look at our earlier picture, which I'm always losing here, this one, expand the pie. Every time you move from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, you basically take the cap. You take the limit of growth, the limit to growth, and remove it. You take the cap to the pie and remove it. He is saying expand the pie. He's talking about evolution, moving, change, and growth continually, not stable state. So he has just said some amazing things about expand the pie, about analytic studies. Analytic being that the world is continually changing. And what you have to understand is the cause and effect relationships to have a sense of what's going to be happening in the future. That things are unknown and unknowable. Okay, so some just real important pieces. So human activity is to expand the pie in here. And in this sense, we are working with that process, that larger universal process, not against it. Working against it is trying to hold things where they are and saying, we want this community to stay just the way it is. We want schools to stay just the way they are. We want our organizations to stay just the way they are. Okay. Knowledge age, let's see. Oh, this now is looking at human activity from the backdrop of thermodynamics, which is looking at the larger system, not just a little piece, and saying the larger systems are really driven by disequilibriums. And that's kind of the driving forces of the larger processes going on in the universe. Disequilibrium and evolution of structures like life that then passes energy through. Okay? So you have evolution of business, which passes energy through. Okay? So these are the two pieces. The focus of human activity then is proactive creation, working with this evolution of the whole, seeking new ways to channel and move energy through. And that's what markets are about, actually. If you think about what free markets are about, it's just saying, this is also saying, communism doesn't work, okay? Free markets is where it's at, to a large extent. I've included a list of references at the back, but there's also a book called Complexity. And that book, which isn't in your references, talks about markets and economics from this perspective, which is a very, very interesting book, even mostly readable. Okay. So human activity then in this knowledge age, remember, if we're looking at evolution and change, it's not about being. This is something that bothered me a lot when I moved to the Northeast and lived in the Northeast for a while. And some of the cultures that I saw, people had this sense that, well, once they got out of high school, they had done all their learning and change that they were ever going to do. And they'd get into a job, and then the contract, their expectation was that I'd go to work for this company, work for 30 years, and retire and have a pension fund at the end. And it was an unspoken expectation, almost a contract between them and the organization. And that's not the case. I mean, this is a world where we're going to have to change the way we think about things, of not just being, I've graduated from high school, I've got my family, accumulating my boat and my cars and my RVs. It's one of becoming and a continual change that we're going to have to do. So it's not that we're there at final end state. A lot of people apply that to their lives. I'm there now. Okay. Looking at learning and creating is the fundamental activity of what we do. This is an open system, where essentially that open system And that's what this is, the genius, the beauty of this. This is an open system, open to the environment here and open to the environment here, taking information in about disequilibriums, which is what essentially market pull is, or market need is, market drive, pulling that information in and finding a way to meet that need, move the energy through, move the dollars through. Okay? But we're the same way. So if you draw in here, instead of an organization, you draw a picture of an individual on top of this. Here's the environment, learning, adapting to it, and changing what we do to create value. It's the same open system model for people as it is for organizations. So we're looking at here, human activity is becoming versus being, learning and creating. That this is intrinsic to humankind because we were created by this process. It directs our actions. And working with this flow instead of trying to control it and direct it and move it in other ways. Like, someone saying that this is the job I trained for and this is the job I expect to have for the rest of my life. And you can't change that on me. Okay. That type of thing. That would be trying to control and hold back change rather than working with it. Okay. 2 more categories in this new frame. And this next one, nature of human activity, the questions we might ask here is, what does it mean to be human? Are people intrinsically good or bad? How are people motivated? If you look at industrial era, we start with the mechanistic view. We have people as poor substitutes for machines. Okay, they're lazy. They need to be extrinsically motivated. They're interchangeable cogs. Right? Think about a small business, a very small business, where maybe 3 people are in it. You don't think about, you take each person in terms of what their skills are and their knowledge is and what it is they can do, and you build a business from that, rather than saying little job descriptions, and then you pull people in and out of that job description, which makes them interchangeable cogs. Okay? It's the interchangeability of parts, right? Interchangeability of people. They're immutable, a closed system. They can't be changed. They're lazy. They're always going to be extrinsically motivated. You probably hear that one. They can't be changed to intrinsic motivation. And there's a doing orientation. Deming talked about people being intrinsically motivated and being precious gems, okay, and the source of creativity. So he's just amazes me, actually. And so I would say here the nature of what does it mean to be human. What we're looking at in this new era is that individuals are learning, evolving, and becoming along the way. This is something that, in a sense, the Eastern religions have almost had, and the Eastern countries have had, and not let go of. Well, we were focused in very short-term boxes and frameworks and found methods to optimize in a short-term box and framework. What the Eastern nations had kept, and that's a generalization, but still is a long-term time view. And they looked at learning, evolving, and becoming as some of the things that they had not let go of. American Indians had that, but it was the Europeans coming over that basically changed our culture. Process unfolding through time, as this is what individuals are, is a process unfolding through time. So just a continual, you are not going to be the same person on Monday when you go back to work as you were when you left on Friday. We're intrinsically motivated, okay, these sorts of things. Diverse, none the same. That's one of the things that comes out of what you begin to see with chaos theory. No 2 snowflakes are the same, right? No 2 people are the same. So it leaves the room for that and recognizes that and says that that's important, as versus saying interchangeable cogs, standardization. Okay. The last piece of this, and this is a big deal one, nature of human relationships. And I don't know if I'll do this justice, but I see this one as being one of the hardest ones to work in the workplace today. How should people relate to one another and distribute power? Okay. Should we be cooperative or competitive, individualistic, collaborative? What are the basis on these relationships? And so again, what I'm trying to do is come from a more science perspective and say, what is all the current research and everything that people are learning and doing? How does it inform this? And I think you'll find that it lines up real well with the things that people who are in this room believe as versus other people who might follow total quality or any of the other flavors. In the industrial era, we're looking at human relationships. Remember, we look at people as independent of one another. We look at man as dominating over nature. We have this, and we're not supreme beings, but on this planet we are, in a sense, supreme beings. The earth is subject to us, and that we can control things. We have that belief. We apply that same thing to people inside the organizations. Those same ideas, the mechanistic model approach. So we have, as a result, we have individualism inside of organizations and competition in between. You have hierarchies of dominance with the highest ones at the very top, right, who can control. And almost, if you look at what's the basis of power, the basis of power is being able to control down here very, very well. And if you can control down here very, very well and get good results, then we bump you up and allow you to control more very, very well. And it's almost this promotion through successful control and getting out results. Okay? So you have this hierarchies of dominance, and the relationship within that hierarchy, at best, is paternalistic. At best, it's paternalistic. And at worst, it's very, very adversarial. Right? Those guys up there are trying to get us down there, and it's part of the reason you have unions in the first place, is because that's the way it was run. Otherwise, again, paternalistic. But not as equals, and not being able to take care of yourself. With paternalistic, there's two sides to that, too. Paternalistic is, one is, if I'm the paternalistic figure, I want to take care of you. Well, that's nice that somebody cares about me. But on the other side, what does it do to the person down below? It not only disempowers them, it basically tells them, you can't take care of yourself. You know, and you get this, this disempowered group about their own lives, right? And so position is related to power. And so this is sort of what comes out of, in terms of human relations, how people relate to one another in a mechanistic industrial age model. What Deming started to talk about was, I mean, you'll recognize some of the words, that we have to be cooperative rather than competitive. He talks about leaders understanding people and nurturing and developing them. This goes along with what does it mean to be human, that they change, that they're not immutable, that they're not interchangeable cogs. Okay, so it's a different relationship here, cooperative in a nurturing, developing relationship. And if you then go, let's take it one step further, and again, this is where I don't even know how to have the words to do this all justice. But if you look at the world, again, it's evolving, and as it evolves, it becomes very complicated, complexity, and interconnected. So inside my body, as versus having all these individual cells that are the same, okay, there's differentiation and high interconnectivity. My body isn't run by one supercell at the top, okay? It's run by actually this whole network, and if you look at neural networks, they have a lot to say about how self-organization arises, actually. So how you get self-organization and how you get consciousness, how you run a complex being like us without a hierarchy saying, okay, move that left hand, okay, and directing and dictating, no single cell up there. What you have is it becomes actually distributed power. And it goes back to, again, that all can affect, but none can control. And you develop patterns of interaction here that allow you to do these higher order activities. And again, I know I'm not going to do this one but anywhere near the justice it needs to be done. But this distributed power, it all comes off of, I want to say, this high interconnectivity. It's where if you have low interconnectivity, meaning you've got someone on the top and you're only connected up and down, okay, vertically inside your organization, then you almost need that person at the top pulling the strings and telling you what to do. But if you have high interconnectivity all throughout with everybody else inside the organization, all other departments, it happens. Okay? And you'll develop patterns that become efficient and effective. And now you don't just leave it all to chance. You can guide that evolution, but it does happen. And it's, I want to say, gives perhaps some faith in self-managing groups. Okay, it creates some sort of faith in doing that. And think about what happens even in a self-managing group, is you have one person who's very good at something else and another person who's very good at something else. You start to get some specialization. And the patterns, who takes the leadership? Whoever's got the knowledge to be able to do it. And it's something you can begin to interchange, move between, rather than saying guy controlling at the top. But one thing is when you have something, pardon? My own echo, I thought I heard a question. Distributed power. When you start to have distributed power like this, and you have higher interconnectivity, you have tremendous interdependence. That is what happens through evolution, and it's all being driven here. This evolution leads to increasing complexity and interdependence. Right. When you have this increasing complexity, increasing interdependence, inability to control, your future is dependent upon somebody else's work, and you can't control what they do. You can't control the rest of the organization. What the relationships then that you have to have between people is one of partnership more than anything else. It's not a dominance, but it's a partnership. I'm interdependent on you, you're interdependent upon me. We can't control each other. We can't control the future. We can affect, but we can't control. How do you make something like that work? It's a partnership relationship. It requires everybody having self-responsibility, which paternalism does away with, in a sense. Paternalism, I want to say, hurts the self-responsibility, drives self-responsibility down. Self-responsibility, you're looking at capability, which is knowledge, and so on, and everybody having to develop that to their own as much as possible. And diversity is incredibly important in all of this. It's the seed for future evolution. So that's the best I can do with this category. And it's not very good because I think it's one of the most important ones, and I need somebody else to work on it. So let me kind of come back here and say what we've done is we've looked at a system of profound knowledge, and we've expanded it. Okay? We've taken profound knowledge and saying, using a functional approach, like adding on different functional categories like sociology, mathematics, ... wouldn't really help us in terms of trying to change and transform organizations, change the way we do things. So what I've been trying to do here today is expand profound knowledge by using a different frame, and it's a frame that is has an anthropological base. It's the way we think about the world that we live in and how we work in it. So this is the frame. We've expanded it out until all of that last hour and a half. And now what we want to do, I think, is come back down and try to somehow condense or summarize and say, what's the essence out of this that we can pull out? So that's where we are now. And this is the way that I would think about doing this. In these next few slides, there's only a few here that you don't have, like maybe 3 or 4. There's a last-minute type thing last night. Like I said, I've been thinking about this. They're the first group I'm talking to about it. So it's tough to be a guinea pig, I guess. When you look at man and his environment, we've been working inside a box, which is time and space. Your organization has had whatever links to within the United States, maybe some links into a couple of other countries. It plans 5 years out into the future, that type of thing. And inside this limited space, the mechanistic model holds. The idea that, and the industrial age practices will give you optimum results inside this box. Okay? It's like, again, I know a lot of you were out still on the break when I mentioned this, but it's like if we were going to design this building on this block, so the frame of this block, Euclidean plane geometry would be fine. Absolutely perfect, no problem. It would give you optimum results. Be optimum because you wouldn't use lots of energy using fancier geometry. Well, what's happening is as a result of our industrial age, we've caused this change in the environment. Telecommunications and computers is expanding the frame that we're working in. It's expanding the time frame in terms of absolute time frame, we're looking at planning out further out, but also relative time frame, in that when you increase the rate of change, it feels like a lot more time has gone through. Okay? So it's a relative time. By increasing the rate of change, you increase the relative time. And it's also increasing the actual physical space through globalization. I mean, you really have to deal with not just having a few foreign cars on the lots here, but you have to deal with all these different cultures, not as subordinates, but as equal players. So we're looking at all these other countries that are becoming equal players in this. Okay? When you start doing that, the old models, the mechanistic models of being able to control, to understand the whole by breaking it into little pieces and parts, to being able to control the whole by controlling the parts, just doesn't apply. It just doesn't work anymore. So when you start working in this larger frame, okay, what you have is, I'm going to say these are the two labels I'm using for the models. Ecologism, which is just taking an ecological perspective on things, evolution, continual change, increasing complexity, interdependence. Thermodynamics is that what is driving bigger pictures, systems, is huge disequilibriums. And that is what's going to drive the larger economic picture, the huge disequilibriums, balance of trade, look at third world countries versus this country, and so on. That is what's going to be driving, okay, what's going on. And so you'll need a whole new set of new management practices in this arena, because here, the mechanistic model stuff won't work at all. Now, if I were going to have a little mom and pop shop down the street that is going to sell sandwiches and Coke, then I probably don't ever have to think about any of this stuff. Okay, if I'm going to be Procter & Gamble, if I'm going to be any of the huge telecommunications industries, computer industries, car industries, anything else, then I need to start thinking about this stuff. Okay, we in the United States won't be able to control, which we still, have as a mentality, the rest of the world. It isn't ours to control. We can affect, but we can't control. What's the relationship between organizations or people? Partnerships because of interdependence. Not paternalism, where we take care of them, and therefore they no longer have the responsibility to take care of themselves. Partnership, right? They've got to maintain responsibility. Other countries, we have to maintain responsibility to take care of ourselves, and recognizing interdependence. So I think all of these things we see are there, but this is the frame that I would put this as. And what made me think about it is that some of the stuff, how would I ever talk to a manager about it? Tell him that he has to stop thinking about controlling and thinking about it will evolve in the world. What will be the new world order in terms of economics and relation? It's going to evolve. It is evolving. We can't control it. It's happening without our direction. How can we guide it and make it a win-win, okay, positive? So and I think the way that I would frame it is this way, is again, inside a box this way, it's fine. When you start moving outside larger issues, which is where we have to live these days, it's not fine anymore. Okay. Summarizing, this is my summary. You can find whatever summary works for you. But if I had to, to task myself with, all right, I can tell these people at OQPF the whole long story, but I can't tell anybody else that, And so how would I begin to summarize these things? I think this is still one of the best pictures to begin to describe what's going on. Okay, it's an open system again. You have here, the whole purpose of this thing is continually value creation. Sensing what the opportunities are. And what are opportunities? They're disequilibriums. Okay? What are the opportunities in the marketplace? How can I create value? Using that, bringing inside and continually changing my organization. Okay, to accomplish that. So I would put here the first one with this picture. The very first thing is value creation. Always keeping your eye on the ball of creating value. My MBA students, at the beginning of the semester, laugh, chortle, make fun, joke. By the end of the semester, they believe it. Okay, but value creation, I think, as being the driving force if we're going to work with the system. Again, there's a few slides here that you don't have, but you've got the essence and the others that are there. What I would add with that, then, the second aspect of that is that it's an open system. There's inexorable evolution. Don't think because right now life is sweet. And I look at the paper industry, which is one that I used to work with. And the paper industry right now is booming. And I bet you they're saying, this is what we need to have, and we need to keep it this way. Right? And the periods that we had a little while ago when things were tougher, it's a good thing we fixed those things. But they're going to try and snapshot it and keep it right where it is, rather than go with it and let it evolve and move forward. Inexorable evolution, okay? Total impermanence. Nothing is the same today as it was yesterday. And crisis is totally, totally natural. Crisis is where you get this birth of a new structure, okay, of a new way of organization. Crisis, when the heat at the bottom of the pot and there's water inside and the random movement of molecules isn't moving the heat fast enough. Crisis is this boiling, bubbling water, okay? Crisis is the formation of a cloud, okay? Those sorts of things. Self-organization is that it is going to happen. It will happen. We don't have to direct it. It's inherent to this. Now, I think you should use your knowledge to direct it so that you don't pick up artifacts and such along the way, right? Now, and one of the things here was we talked about the United States in a global perspective as well. It is going to organize in some way. Now, we can either be partner to it or say, no, we still want this dominant role and be the patriarch, or have a, not a patriarch, but a paternalistic sort of view to the rest of the world. And that's holding where we are rather than going forward and evolving along with it. Increasing complexity and interdependence. Deming talks about interdependence. And complexity, we could talk about different things in here. It is not the complexity that comes from trying to fix broke systems. When you try to hold on to broken systems that don't work anymore and you patch and you patch and you patch and you patch. That's holding back change. And that's a complexity that doesn't add value. This is complexity in terms of single cell to human body, which is multiple, differentiated, complex, and is more efficient. So you have complexity driving efficiency, and you have increasing interdependence. It's a fact of life, as I would say. Human role. Okay, the human role here, if I were going to summarize it, I want to say that we're part of the larger whole, created and driven by the same forces. Okay? We're part of this whole larger system. We can affect, but we cannot control. And you've probably heard the words codependent arising. It means the world is evolving and becoming what it is as we are. It's codependent. What the world becomes is dependent upon us, and what we are is dependent upon the world, and it's codependent moving together. Excuse me, human role, learners and creators expand the pie. Now, that's probably the best way to shorthand it. Human relationships, partners, instead of in terms of either adversarial, like competition, or in terms of patriarchal or paternalistic, okay, any of those things, partners. We're densely interconnected, and actually densely interconnected is necessary. If we try to keep people separated in terms of keeping information away from them, you won't have the self-organization. I mean, we're actually fighting the system at that point in time. Densely interconnected, like our brain cells are densely interconnected, is one of the characteristics that enables this whole thing to go forward. Trust. If you're densely interconnected, you depend upon somebody else. We're looking at almost moving back to values. You've probably seen one of the recent HBR or Sloan magazine, Sloan journals, talking about managing by trust and all this. Well, that's why all this stuff is coming up, because you have to work more in a partnership mode. You can't work in a top-down controlling type of mode. Self-motivation instead of extrinsic motivation, this is what we have to do. Okay? And personal responsibility goes hand in hand with that. And in terms of human relationships, what I wanted to say here too is that you're looking at not partnership at the expense of individuals, not individuals at the expense of partnership. It's a dynamic. You have to hold them both there together. Okay. This is what I would use as my summary with a management group and say, now let's look at systems that we have to put in place. And do your systems work with these principles or work against these principles? And look at new new ideas in management through this lens. Okay. And implications then accelerating. So we've got accelerating rate of evolution. And I think I'll leave, we've covered all of this. The WIFM slide, what's in it for me? That's the people sitting here. I guess these are the things that I'd like you to carry out, this understanding that there is a hierarchy of levels in organizations. And that goes back to our iceberg diagram at the very beginning, saying that although what everybody in management wants to do is change what's happening here, because certainly what people do determines results, understand that there's first order and second order change. Okay, and that if you want to change what's happening here, sometimes it requires second order change going down to deeper levels. And that changing at these different levels requires a whole different set of principles along with it. So understand the hierarchy of levels in organizations. Accept the change. Well, in a sense, it's preaching to the choir because you're in here. Willing to re-examine your own assumptions and look at what they are. Let them go. Let go of control, which is one of the hardest things. Let go of control and learn, okay, along the way. This one, practice active learning, you probably know that, but this one I want to say to everybody, and I don't mean you, I mean, this is the message I'd want to say. Be good citizens of the world, because you can affect but you can't control, and what goes around comes around. You're interdependent, you're interconnected, and I feel like that's something that we just need to pick up. Change agents, and maybe this applies to you folks, as change agents, stop trying to transform the organization, okay? That it is going through evolution right now. I mean, again, when you go back to work, it'll be different than it was before. So stop trying to change it, and I want to say, go with the knowledge age assumptions and look for the disequilibriums. Now look for the places where there's pain and where they're going to let you in and where you can actually begin to help guide evolution through. And, stop the program of the month, which is a single point of change in to fix a broken to a fixed state.